and welcome to Knowledge Area 3 of OIR 103, the course dealing with the African dealings in the world affairs. The course title is Africa in the Global Context, which is offered by the Department of Political Science and Public Administration of the Open University of Tanzania, and it is administered by Raj Kitigu. Today we are going to deal with Africa and the pluralized world. You know, the world order has been changing with time. It has been changing as time goes and depending on what is transpiring thereof. These changes have been affecting in different ways the African continent. We have had the bipolar world order, which occurred between 1945, following the end of the Second World War, to the mid-1980s, which was followed by a unipolar world order, predominantly reigned by the United States of America. And currently, we have kind of a multipolar world order, which involves multiple strong actors with almost equal powers. Let's see how the bipolar world order looks like. Bipolarity can be defined as a system of world order in which the majority of global economic, military, and cultural influence is held between two states. The classic case of a bipolar world is that of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, which dominated the second half of the 20th century, which I mentioned earlier. It was sometime between the end of the Second World War and the mid-1980s. So from 1945 to the late 1980s, the bipolar world was characterized by Cold War politics, where the East and the West bloc were under tension. The East and the Soviet Union, and the West and the United States of America. The main causes of the tension was that of Soviet Union, which was trying to spread communism. The United States, on the other hand, was against communism, and they took leadership of containment policy. Africa was highly affected as immediately after independence, these new states were manipulated. They were manipulated to choose between the two sides, the East or the West. Thus, it was their choice. But some of them decided to stand in between the two polars. Thus, Africa was held in two rival camps, marked by economic and political ideologies. On the right were the capitalists and its political twin, democracy, and even its economic approach, capitalism, that was bastioned by the United States and Western allies, mostly in Western Europe. Communism and its authoritarian political institutions, it is said, on the other hand, occupied the left and were championed by the former Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, also known as the Soviet Union, and her eastern allies, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and the like. There are some practical examples of effects of the Cold War in Africa, and these include the proxy civil war between the MPLA and UNITA in Angola. MPLA was led by Jose Eduardo dos Santos, and UNITA was led by Jonas Savimbi. And this was the war that resulted into catastrophe. It resulted into deaths for many civilians in Angola. MPLA, on the one hand, was supported by the Eastern Wing, led by the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, while UNITA was supported by the Western Wing, led by the United States of America. The proxy civil wars between Frelimo and Renamo in Mozambique were more or less of the same nature as those of MPLA versus UNITA, whereby Frelimo was a comrade party with MPLA, and they were both supported by the Soviet Union and the Eastern Wing, while Renamo and UNITA were equally supported by the Western Wing, Western blocs under the United States of America. Equally important is what came after the Second World War, what is called the non-aligned movement, whereby some African countries, and in actual sense, most of the independent African states joined the non-aligned movement wing that postured itself somewhere in between the East and the West, and with the intent not to support either side. Though some analysts would say that there was nothing like the non-aligned movement. Also, as a result of the bipolar world war, was the assassination of the Congolese first Prime Minister by name Patrice Lumumba. Patrice Lumumba was assassinated in a plot that was led by the American Central Intelligence Agency. It is alleged so. Regard must be had to the fact that Patrice Lumumba was a staunch supporter of communism, which was championed by the Soviet Union, which was a rival to the Western arm led by the United States of America. So, for more than 2 decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and concomitantly Cold War in the late 1980s, the United States of America became a dominant world power, with Western powers queuing behind her, and it reigned up until the 2000s. And this was the beginning of the unipolar world. The unipolar world was very dangerous for weak nations of Africa, which were at the mercy of the greedy and appointed policeman of the world, I mean the United States of America, who spread lies and propaganda with a view to military and corporate occupations. Among the outcomes of the unipolar world were democratic revolutions in Africa. You remember from the early 1990s, Africa witnessed a landslide revolution in democracy. And that's the time where there were the restoration of multiparty politics, which were banned sometimes in the 1960s, immediately after independence of many African countries. So during this unipolar world, whose dominance was in favor of the United States of America, many dictators were pushed to the margin of the political landscape. Some scholars believed that this democratic revolution would be irreversible and that dictators would find it increasingly difficult to remain in power. And one such scholar is Samuel Huntington in his book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, which was published in 1991. Other scholars believed it was the end of history, and one such scholar was Francis Fukuyama, an American come Japanese origin citizen and scholar who believed that the emergence of liberal democracy all over the world would mark the end of history in the world, and no any other form of governance will emerge later on. Though this is just an ideal type construct of the capitalist and the liberal scholars who normally believe that liberal democracy is the best form of governance ever on earth. During the unipolar world order, democracy was a critical agenda in Africa. But why should it have been that way? Why was the West suddenly preoccupied with the prospects of democracy in Africa? These are very important questions that are to be posed at this juncture. That immediately after the emergence of the unipolar world order that was predominantly led by the United States and its allies of Western Europe, much was done to democratize Africa, whether they liked it or not. And to answer these questions, we must examine the traditional arguments against establishing liberal democracy in Africa. First, some Africanist scholars believe that Africa has its own unique history and traditions. The view is that the introduction of liberal democracy, which is an alien concept, would violate the integrity of African culture. Whether this is true or wrong remains to be discussed. And another argument is that there is a misconception that democracy is solely Western creation or creature. That the Western scholars, the Western nations, did believe that democracy is theirs, and that other forms of governance do not have any element of the role of the people, for the people, and by the people. So they tended to author democracy both as a concept and as a practice. The second argument against liberal democracy in Africa is that the social pluralism of African societies, particularly ethnic differences, would render difficulties in practicing liberal democracy in the continent. And that is because African societies are replete with ethnic conflicts. So they must be firmly governed. They must be ruled by the club. They must be ruled repressively. And that the liberties of liberal democracy would inflame ethnic rivalries and pose the danger of political disintegration, like what we have been seeing, hearing, experiencing in Uganda, in South Sudan, in Kenya, in Egypt, in Burundi, in Nigeria, in Somalia, and even in Rwanda. Much the same is true of Cote d'Ivoire. See? Let's pick the example of Egypt. Egypt has a unique form of governance, which if it used to copy the liberal democracy of the West, then governance in Egypt will be in shambles. And every time it tries to practice liberal democracy, chaos occurred in Egypt. See? I remember in 2011, Mohammed Hosni Mubarak was toppled from presidency, and came the liberal democratically elected host Mohammed Morsi in 2012. Mohammed Morsi did not stay long. Did not stay long because the nature and culture of Egypt does not accommodate the liberal democratic values of the West. And so they moved back to the military junta, though the current president, Al-Sisi, Abdul Fattah al-Sisi, says he has relinquished from the army, and now he is a civilian. That is just in theory, but Abdul Fattah al-Sisi is a soldier, and is supported by the Egyptian army. That's the reality. So, what's the problem with democratic rules in Africa? Is it the absence of democracy? Or is it bad governance? Or is it poverty? Or is it foreign intervention? These are other questions to be posed, and their answers can give us a direction to where Africa should be headed to. Another argument against liberal democracy in Africa is that democracy must be considered in the context of Africa's most pressing needs, especially emancipating the people from ignorance, poverty, and disease. These are the enemies Mwalimu Nyerere of Tanzania used to fight against right from the word go of independence: ignorance, poverty, and disease. The argument is that the pursuit of liberal democracy will not feed the hungry or heal the sick, nor will it give shelter to the homeless. That elections by themselves cannot feed the hungry, or cannot heal the sick, and cannot give shelter to those with no home. Another argument that contravenes the liberal democratic values and practice in Africa is that chiefdom or kingdom is a suitable form of governance for Africans. And that's why African leaders stay long in power. So it's no wonder that we have had African leaders who have stayed for 20, 30 years in power. They practice the chiefdom form of governance, and it is the African tradition of leadership. In fact, Africa has had most of longest-serving leaders, say presidents or prime ministers, and those leaders who have stayed long in office claim to be committed to solving the problem of their people, which actually have been an endless predicament. And some of these leaders include this Museveni, who has been in power since 1986, and of recent, the Ugandan constitution has been changed to allow him to be the president for life. So he has been in power for almost 33 years. You see? Another one is Denis Sassou Nguesso of Congo Brazzaville. This man came to the presidency twice. He first came to power in 1979 and ran up to 1992. And then he was defeated, but he did not give up and rejuvenated later in 1997 to present. And so he has, in sum, been to power for 35 years. See, the same president in Congo Brazzaville for 35 years, as if some other people are not there. Robert Mugabe, the late Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, stayed in power since 1980 until 2017, when he was smoothly overthrown by his army. You see, this is a portrait of the time when Mugabe was in power. You see, the United States of America has had 7 presidents, while Zimbabwe has had only 1. We start with Gerald Ford, followed by Ronald Reagan, then George R. Bush, then Bill Clinton, then George Walker Bush, followed by Barack Obama, followed by Donald Trump. So during Gerald Ford's rulership, Mugabe was in power. During Ronald Reagan's reign, Mugabe was still in power. When George R. Bush came to power, Mugabe was still in power. Clinton came and went, Mugabe was still in power. George Walker Bush came and finished his 2 terms, Mugabe was in power. Barack Obama spent 2 terms in presidential office in the United States of Africa. Mugabe was still in power. Donald Trump and Robert Mugabe had a 1-year in presidents together before Robert Mugabe was overthrown, and then later, a year later, died. And there is another man who has stayed in power for more than 40 years, for about 40 years. He is not very known to most of Africans, simply because he has accommodated the Westerners to siphon the oil resources in his country. You know, once you provoke the Westerners, they will deal with you until you go out of power. This man is unknown. He is not known very much. This one is Barack Obama, but this one cannot be easily identified. He came to power since he was in his youth stage in 1979 by overthrowing his uncle. And until now, he is the elder, but still in power. This is his image when he was in power in 1979. His face is so small. Now, his face here is so scary, but still in power. This is not other than but Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo of Equatorial Guinea. He came to power in 1979. He overthrew his mother's brother, Mathias Nguema. You see? So he has served the presidency for 40 years, and he doesn't feel like getting out of power. The longest serving president in Africa is Paul Biya of Cameroon. He has been in the post since 1975. It's now 44 years have gone by since he became president. You see? So you can see the difference between other regions of the world with Africa in terms of governance. And the argument has been that chiefdom is a suitable form of governance in Africa, and not otherwise. If you transplant democracy from the West and try to plant it out in Africa, it won't work. So, during the unipolar world, the role of the West has been trying to democratize Africa. And by democratizing, I mean instilling with it the liberal form of democracy. And the methods that have been used include providing aid or imposing sanctions, sometimes imposing conditionalities. Remember the structural adjustment programs that were imposed in the late 1980s. In line with the collapse of the Eastern Wing. They sometimes support the insurgencies. If a leader becomes very strong, then the West have been intrinsically supporting the insurgency in order to overthrow the existing regimes in Africa so as to implement their own liberal form of democracy. Sometimes the West has been using coercive means, and a good example is Libya, whereby the West stormed to overthrow and kill Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, believing that having removed Muammar Gaddafi, then they would impose the liberal form of democracy with all its values. But to date, it hasn't worked. Moreover, the unipolar world order reintroduced multiparty system in Africa, as well as the rise of civil society and the growth of women's rights. These are very positive things because by the introduction of multi-party system, then it allowed for the competition during elections between various parties and ideologies and the like. And as a consequence of the US-led unipolar system, the world is now said to have a greater number of liberal democratic political systems than at any time in history. Equally important was the fact that foreign intervention in the internal affairs of African countries, led by the uncontested lone superpower, the United States with its allies, were immense. For example, as I said earlier, in the US-led NATO invasion in Libya, that led to the killing of the leader of that country, as well as the French interventions in its former colonies. Another example of US intervention in Africa during the unipolar world order was the brief but bitter American fighting experience in Mogadishu, Somalia, where 18 US elite military personnel were killed by Mohammed Farah Aidid's militia in 1993. You remember Mohammed Farah Aidid was a rebel who was fighting against the existing regime of that time in Somalia, which was imposed by the West following the toppling of Mohammed Siad Barre, who was the famed president there. But following such bitter experience, the United States is now trying as much as possible to avoid becoming enmeshed in brutal African intrastate confrontations. So it has been operating behind the scene, emulating the Nixon doctrine. Now it is the African people who must fight African war. They use proxy wars instead of going direct themselves. The unipolar world order had some negative outcomes as well in Africa. You know, when the US mishandled some of the issues such as ethnic and religious matters, these have led to instability and struggle for power in Africa. And some of the interpretations, thinking that all Muslims are terrorists, has resulted into several dangers in Africa. These have led to civil wars in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Sudan, in Burundi, in Liberia, and even in Cote d'Ivoire. See? Much the same is true in Eritrea and Nigeria. And these civil wars have killed mostly civilians and created humanitarian disasters. It's also important to mention the concept of terrorism. You know, when the United States was hit hard in 1998 in its embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, as well as in its World Trade Center in New York, it came up with the global war on terrorism, and it enforced other states to follow suit. And those who did not support the United States were considered as enemies. This is a very wrong connotation of stances among nations in the world, that they have to choose either with the United States or with the terrorists, and then there is no any other alternative choice. That was a wrong interpretation in my view. During the unipolar phase, the United States of America was criticized almost all over the world for the self-imposed duty of global police. But in my view, again, the United States was in fact and indeed highly qualified to play this role, whether anybody, any nation, or any continent liked it or not. Immediately after the attack by the terrorists in the American Embassy in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi, as well as in the World Trade Center in New York, in the United States started to be weak a little bit, whereby people find that many other strong actors were emerging, hence the emergence of multipolar world order. Multipolarity is a distribution of power in which more than two nations have nearly equal amount of military, cultural, and economic influence in the world. So, as the 21st century progresses, the framework of international system is again moving from unipolar to a multipolar structure. An enormous economic accomplishment of a few nations like China, Brazil, and India have prompted a new debate on the emerging world order. It is important to understand what is emerging and multipolar means for Africa. Will Africa fall victim to a new scramble over raw material and political hegemony between superpowers? Or that this new multipolar world order offer African countries greater room for negotiation and maneuvering, eventually leading to stronger democracy, enhanced growth, and increased possibility to address their own problems? It is clear that Africa is currently undergoing dramatic changes, both politically and economically. Some African countries are experiencing rapid economic growth, like South Africa, Nigeria, to mention a few. However, most of the continent's dynamic sectors, such as minerals, gold and precious stones, and tourism, and biofuel development, are to a large degree influenced and controlled by external interests. You can see most of the investors in the mineral, in the gold, in precious stones, in biofuel are largely foreigners. The economic growth has not been inclusive, and with a few exceptions, and Botswana is always mentioned, only a few benefits have not been passed to the broader African population. See? The new global actors such as China, Brazil, Malaysia, and Turkey have expanded their geopolitical presence in Africa. China, for example, is today Africa's third largest trading partner after the United States and France. The Chinese development aid to Africa is also expanding rapidly, and it's threatening the Western interests. The worry is that these new global actors' relations with sub-Saharan African countries are merely driven by the demand for raw material, and this may result in a new scramble for and partition of Africa among those big actors, and in particular the second-tier states. Brazil is also emerging. I have decided to structure the international system in the 21st century as it appears there. This has been borrowed from Raymond Duncan and his compatriots. But Africa is not there. Africa is negligible. Most of the actors are the United States, second-tier states, Japan, China, and European Union. Though the European Union is also becoming weak following its different interests among its members, and some would like to quit, like the United Kingdom. Others include Russia and its former states, the Asian states, the Asian tiger, and Latin America. Africa is nowhere to be seen. This is how the international system appears like. And the reality is, trading activities are huge among these main actors. You would think that perhaps the United States trades much with the Africa. No, not even between Africa and Europe. Most of the commodities that are manufactured in Europe are traded in other regions than in Africa. Africa perhaps had the importance of being a dumping place. Having analyzed the different world orders and their implication on Africa, I would say that the multipolarization of the international system and the rise of nations from the global south, China, Brazil, and India, have opened new avenues for Africa and increased the continent's role in global politics, but only if it has the capability and it has the intention to utilize that avenue. However, various analysis suggests that Africa has always been prey to the other predators. And perhaps it's high time now Africa thought of new approaches toward interacting with the rest of the world. Remember, in this broken world, African countries have to learn to navigate a sea of troubles. Thank you.